Hello everyone, Dr. Jonathan Williams here, and today we come to the final part of Romans 9 and Paul's great conclusion. It's been an enjoyable journey, at least for me, and I hope it has been for you, as we have examined Romans 9 verse by verse. Now we're coming to the end of Romans 9, as Paul has been retelling the story of his people, and we come to the great conclusion at which Paul arrives. So let's read these verses 22 through 29 of Romans chapter 9. Paul said this: "What if God, although willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much patience vessels of wrath prepared for destruction? And he did so, to make known the riches of his glory upon vessels of mercy, which he prepared beforehand for glory. Even us, whom he also called, not from among Jews only, but also from among Gentiles. As he says also in Hosea, I will call those who are not my people, and her who is not beloved, beloved. And it shall be that in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God." Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, "Though the number of the sons of Israel be like the sand of the sea, it is the remnant that will be saved. For the Lord will execute his word on the earth thoroughly and quickly." And just as Isaiah foretold, unless the Lord of Sabaoth had left to us a posterity, we would have become like Sodom and would have resembled Gomorrah. Now, one thing that should strike us about these verses is that Paul has returned to a style that he has used throughout the chapter. And that style is what we call using pairs. He told two stories from the patriarchal period, using two passages for each one. He told two stories from the Exodus events and the two times that God revealed his glorious name. Now, Paul uses two prophets, Hosea and Isaiah, with two passages from each. From Hosea, Paul used chapter 2 and verse 23 and chapter 1 and verse 10. And from Isaiah, Paul used chapter 10 and verses 22 and 23 and chapter 1 and verse 9. The prophecies were about two things: the sinful condition of his people and God's merciful promise to restore them. Now, Paul then applied them to two peoples, the Jews and the Gentiles. Such beauty, such symmetry, showing that Paul has long thought about these things, and he has refined his presentation in the forge of ministry among his people as he traveled from synagogue to synagogue. But Paul has now reached the conclusion of his thought, the conclusion of the story of his people, by quoting from the prophets. It's such a beautiful story because it's about God's faithfulness. As we know, Romans 9:6 is the key statement that God has been faithful to his word. The purpose of God has not failed. That purpose which he announced to Abraham, "In you, Abraham, I am going to bless all the families of the earth," that purpose was going forward in Paul's time. God was keeping his word. And so Paul, at the end of this section, used the prophets to establish that point. What was happening in his day was that the remnant of Israel was being saved, and Gentiles were coming into that nation. Genesis 12:3 was coming true, just as the prophets foretold that it would come true. So Paul's now finished telling his story, the story of his people, by referencing these three great periods of their history: the patriarchal age, the Exodus events, and the prophetic ministry. And he's now ready to summarize it all and to answer a question that has been surfacing from time to time in this passage. What is that question? What is the distinguishing mark between the true children of Abraham and those who are not? Remember chapter 9 and verse 6, the second part of verse 6, 9:6b? Paul said, they are not Israel who are descended from Israel. Remember verse 9:7, where Paul said, nor are they all children just because they are Abraham's descendants. So what distinguished those who were not Israel from Israel, those who are not children from the children? Well, was it strict Torah observance? That's what those living in Qumran were saying. We are Israel, and the rest of you are not Israel. The Pharisees were pretty much saying the same thing, although they did not disassociate themselves from the people. They did not go off into the wilderness. They lived among the people. But the Pharisees were pretty much saying the same thing. We who observe strict Torah obedience and pay attention to the meticulous details of the Torah, and we who are faithfully carrying out those meticulous details, we are Israel, and the rest are cursed. Israel means faithfully adhering to the laws of Moses. What was Paul's answer? No, it's not meticulous Torah observance. It is faith in the crucified and risen Messiah. And this brings us to the last verses of Romans chapter 9. Paul said this, "What shall we say then?" In other words, here's my conclusion. What are we going to say about all these things? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness attained righteousness, even the righteousness which is by faith. But Israel, pursuing a law of righteousness, did not arrive at that law. That is, they did not come to the conclusion, the goal of it all. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as though it were by works. They stumbled over the stumbling stone, just as it is written, "Behold, I lay in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and he who believes in him will not be disappointed." Paul has concluded where he began. He began with a great story of faith from the life of Abraham, and now he concludes with comments about faith. Did you notice that in these verses? In verse 30, Paul said, the Gentiles gained righteousness by faith. Israel did not gain it by faith. Did not gain righteousness. Why not? Because, as it says in verse 32, they stumbled over the stumbling stone. And that stumbling stone was faith in the crucified and risen Messiah. Now, would you allow me to get ahead of myself again just a bit? I've been saying that I'm going to get into detail with the Calvinist position and where our Calvinist brethren have gone wrong. Those studies are coming. They're coming next as we finish today our verse-by-verse explanation of Romans chapter 9. But let me give you a teaser on this and the fallacy of the Calvinist interpretation. If Romans 9 is the great chapter on unconditional election to salvation, as we are told by our Calvinist brethren, then these verses 30 through 33, would be the perfect place to drive home this so much very important doctrine. We are told that it's so important. But Paul didn't do that, did he? Paul could have said something like, and so we see that what distinguishes those who are saved from those who are not saved is God's unconditional election. God chooses some to salvation and others he just passes over or he condemns them to eternity forever. He has chosen them for that judgment. But Paul doesn't come anywhere close to saying that. What does he talk about? He talks about faith versus works. Now, allow me to say a few words about Romans 10 and 11 that will drive this point home. Romans 9, we remember, does not end the book of Romans, and Paul was far from finished in telling the story of his people and updating it for the times in which they lived. In Romans chapter 10, we find that Paul elaborated not on some doctrine of unconditional election, but he elaborated on faith. Faith, not unconditional election, was the distinguishing mark between those in Israel who were Israel and those who were not Israel, between the children and those who were not really the children. Faith and unbelief is what separated the people. Thus, as we look at Romans 10, and you see all the verses listed before you that emphasize faith, and I'm not going to read all of them for you. You can pause the video here and write down all the verses if you wish. But as you can see from these verses in Romans chapter 10, Paul takes this key thought that he concluded Romans 9 with, and that he already used in Romans chapter 4 when talking about justification of people before God, and now he uses it to relate it to the whole nation and national justification. And his point is faith, not unconditional election. Then as we move into Romans chapter 11, we find Paul's assertion that God has not rejected the physical descendants of Abraham. God has not irrevocably set aside Israel despite their unbelief. Paul reminded everyone that some have believed, himself being one of them. Just as God had a remnant in the time of Elijah, so God had a remnant in Israel in his time, in the time in which Paul lived. And then he said in verse 5, in the same way then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to God's gracious choice. Now, the literal translation of this, the literal rendering of this would be a remnant according to the election of grace. Now, this was not Paul advocating unconditional election. This was Paul reaching back to what he said in verse 11 of chapter 9, that God's method of election to move the purpose forward was not based upon the works of Torah observance. That's what he's referring to here in verse 5. He's going back to verse 11 of chapter 9. And this would have been a key point to reiterate in his day, because he was not battling with free will theologians as he was trying to advance some kind of sovereign grace theology. He was battling with people who were basing their status before God by their strict Torah observance. That was the issue in the first century. Those who were attempting to advance God's plan in the world by this strict Torah observance. Now, we also know that unconditional election was not in Paul's mind, because in the very next verse, in verse 6, he did not contrast the election of grace with faith, as some would have us believe, but he contrasted grace with works. In Romans, grace and faith always work together. They are never in opposition to each other. They always work together. The contrast is always grace and works. This is the contrast. And all this would underscore what he said about Abraham and David in Romans chapter 4. Those men set a pattern of faith that Paul and others were following as they believed, as they put their faith in the crucified and risen Messiah. But what about those who did not believe? The unbelieving portion of Israel was hardened, Paul says in verses 7 through 10, just like Pharaoh was hardened. In one of the great ironies of history, the people of God now resembled their first great national oppressor. And yet, Paul, ever the optimist, held out hope even for those who had been hardened. As we know in chapter 10 and verse 1, he prayed for their salvation. And he said that their stumbling over the stumbling stone of the crucified Messiah in verses 32 and 33 of Romans 9 was not for their downfall here in verse 11. He said, may it never be. Paul adamantly said, yes, they stumbled, and the remnant attained righteousness, and they moved the covenant purpose forward by taking the good news to the nations as promised to Abraham. But their stumbling and their hardening was not for their downfall. Paul's hope was that as more Gentiles turned to Israel's Messiah, as more Gentiles entered into the remnant of Israel, that the unbelieving portion, those who stumbled and were hardened, would be stirred up, and they would come to faith too. This is hardly unconditional election before the foundation of the world to condemnation. Paul then went to the metaphor of the olive tree. Israel was the olive tree. The Gentiles were from wild olive tree, wild branches from wild olive trees, and they were being grafted into the cultivated olive tree, which was Israel. Those Jews who did not believe were broken off, but they could be grafted back into the tree if they did not persist in their unbelief. They could come back into this tree. This was a great mystery, Paul said, but the hardening was only a partial hardening of Israel, to allow the full entry of Gentiles to come into the people of God as God promised to Abraham. God hardened them temporarily, and the unbelieving people of Israel might position themselves as enemies right now. They might argue, they might riot, they might persecute, they might even kill some of the followers of the Messiah. And yet Paul, with his eyes always on the amazing faithfulness of God, said, they're still beloved. God still loves them in spite of this atrocious behavior. God had not irrevocably condemned them for their unbelief, let alone predestined them from eternity past for hell. God had not irrevocably condemned them, just as he had not in the days of the prophets. In the days of the prophets, they announced judgment, but they also announced restoration for the very ones who had been judged. In the same way, God was pronouncing judgment upon his people in Paul's day. He had hardened them, and judgment was approaching, but that did not mean that the hardening was permanent. Paul held out this hope for his people. The ones over whom he agonized with sorrow and with grief, he prayed for their salvation, and he believed that God could graft them back into the people of God. And this is how he expressed this hope in verses 30 through 32. Paul said, For just as you once were disobedient to God, but now have been shown mercy because of their disobedience, so these also now have been disobedient, that because of the mercy shown to you, they also may now be shown mercy. For God has shut up all in disobedience, so that he may show mercy to all. And now Paul was finished. This is where he had been heading all along. The salvation of all his people. There was no need for him to become accursed, as he had expressed in the opening words of Romans chapter 9. They could come back into the people of God by faith in the crucified and risen Messiah if they just would not be so stubborn. The hardening could be lifted. And this led Paul to his great benediction at the end of Romans 11. He said, "Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who became his counselor, or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen." So as we can see in this great benediction of praise and worship, Paul held out this hope for his people, the ones over whom he agonized with sorrow and grief, and he prayed for their salvation, and he believed that God could graft them back in, and it would lead to great worship and great praise. Well, I wish we could end this teaching series here. Wouldn't it be nice if there was no disagreement on this beautiful, amazing passage of Scripture? But unfortunately, there is much disagreement. The beauty of Romans 9 has become like the battle-scarred lands of Europe during World War I. Paul's beautiful landscape has been turned into a gloomy, gray, no-man's land. Trenches have been dug. God's people have been firing at each other for centuries. The firing has come from both sides in what some call the Reform versus non-Reform debate. Others call it Calvinism versus Arminianism, Augustine versus the Church Fathers, whatever you call it. If you engage in this debate, I hope that it will be a discussion, less of a debate and more of a discussion, and done in a Christ-like manner for the edification of all who are listening, rather than a rancorous type and venomous type debate with each other. That's just uncalled for and ungodly, and this does not please the Lord. But in the next episodes, I am going to turn from Paul's telling of the story to the story that our dear Calvinist brethren are telling in a very unfortunate manner. And I hope to do this with love and respect, and I hope that you will join us for each one of these and tell your friends to listen. I hope that you will join in a spirit of humility, in a spirit of love and respect, no matter what your theological persuasion is. And I look forward to this very much. This is Dr. Jonathan Williams with Word of God Speak, informing and inspiring your faith. The Lord bless you all.
If you're interested in more resources from Dr. Williams, be sure to check out the website wgsministries.org or click the link in the description. Our hope is that these resources will help you grow in your relationship with God through Jesus Christ.